Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's session. I'm Rachel Sprouse, a graduating MLA student at Cornell, and I'll be your MC. If you have questions for today's speaker, Signe Nielsen, which I'm sure you will, please use the Zoom Q&A feature and we'll take questions at the end if there's time. Also, if you're a licensed professional and would like to receive 1 CEU credit for this course, please visit www.labash.org/laces, and I'll be sure to put that in the chat once I'm finished with my introduction. And so now I'm excited to introduce our speaker, who's Signe Nielsen. And she has been practicing as a landscape architect and urban designer in New York since 1978. And her body of work has renewed the environmental integrity and transformed the quality of spaces for those who live, work, and play in the urban realm. Ms. Nielsen believes in using design as a vehicle for advocacy to promote discourse on social equity and community resilience, and has served on multiple panels to effect positive change. A fellow of the ASLA, she is the recipient of over 100 national and local design awards for public open space projects, and is a professor of urban design and landscape architecture at Pratt Institute. Born in Paris, Ms. Nielsen holds degrees in urban planning from Smith College, in landscape architecture from City College of New York, and in construction management from Pratt Institute. Today, she's presenting her talk, Equity by Design. So welcome, Signe.
Thank you so much. Should I go ahead and share my screen?
You should, yes.
All right. All right. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that generous introduction. Thank you, LA Bash organizers. You've really been on it. And welcome to all of you who have joined this afternoon. It's an honor to have been invited to share some of my thoughts with you. So let's dive right in. Intro here. Landscape architecture is at a crossroads. The pandemic has taught us the value of open space and its need to be regarded as critical infrastructure. Yet so many of our public spaces remain symbols of fear and hopelessness rather than places that embrace equity and inclusion. I want to focus today on how we, as emerging or established landscape architects, can help communities amplify their voices using diverse means so that we can fuse our professional abilities with community knowledge to co-create meaningful places. The first step in this is to recognize our own biases and the lenses through which we and others view the world. Second, we must understand who really owns a space and is therefore the true client. So we're going to look at 3 examples today that strive to illustrate what equitable, positive change looks like in vulnerable communities. Each one of these projects has taught our firm useful lessons that I'd like to share with you. So I'll just pause for a minute and let you read, and we'll go over each one. So the first one is Pier 42. And it really highlights an example of a project where we decided to kind of alter the stakeholder outreach process. Pier 42 is located on the East River on the Lower East Side of Manhattan within a community district that ranks very high on the Social Vulnerability Index. Back in 2010, the New York City Economic Development Corporation, that I will refer to from now on as EDC, envisioned Pier 42 as the terminus of the East River Esplanade, shown in orange going toward the left, that begins at the Brooklyn Bridge. This fairly recently completed Esplanade is really geared more to the financial district, users, and tourists. Not surprisingly, therefore, the proposed design for the pier immediately met with broad community resistance. This view of the proposed pier design from that era essentially illustrates a generic waterfront open space on the 8 acres of the site that speaks more to the esplanade design to the south rather than to the adjacent community. The community's objections were synthesized in a document called the People's Plan, from which this image is taken. This points out just one of the neighborhood's many vulnerabilities, with 85% of 84,000 residents living in subsidized housing. The majority are Asian or Latinx by their own identification. Many of the concerns expressed in the People's Plan revolved around fear of gentrification and displacement that the EDC design would engender. Broadly speaking, the People's Plan points to lack of sensitivity to local cultural diversity and absence of community input in the design. The People's Plan was effectively a capacity building process that coalesced a consortium of stakeholders to initiate and maintain a sustained campaign to keep residents informed about the planning and design of the next iteration of the permanent park. Community voices reached the upper levels of City Hall, who brokered a jurisdictional transfer from of the Pier from EDC to the New York City Parks Department, an agency who is viewed as more sympathetic to neighborhood concerns. At this juncture, our firm was brought on to restart the visioning and design process. So this is a mess, and don't try to read it, but suffice it to say that this project has been going on for more than a decade, with many fits and starts due to agency missteps, funding shortfalls, and laborious coordination with adjacent resiliency construction. This timeline only represents the years since our firm has been working on the project. I do want to draw your attention to the 5-year-long light blue bar labeled Paths to Pier 42, which I will speak about in a moment. But a lesson learned, I think, generally for a number of projects is that the protracted duration of many publicly funded projects frequently generate anger, frustration, and cynicism among community members, because after the initial flurry of engagement, the dark blue bar here, often there is little subsequent public discourse. This gap in communication further reinforces the importance of having a trusted civic organization serve as the conduit for information between the time a project obtains community consensus and the time a shovel goes in the ground. The site has magnificent views up and down the East River, bookended by 2 iconic bridges. The major challenge, however, was an enormous shed seen in the lower image that blocked views as well as access to the river. Behind the shed lies a parking lot and a highway, partially elevated and partially at grade, leaving the site contaminated, noisy, and very difficult to access from the neighborhood. This essentially summarizes the key site conditions, showing the single point of access across, actually under the highway, and the distribution of the 8 acres between pier deck and upland parking lot. I'll also point out the Department of Transportation has an absolutely absurd pothole repair facility that is the first thing labeled DOT, the first thing that you see upon entering the pier. We started this project literally one day after Hurricane Sandy. Many public housing residents were left without power or water for months. The top image shows the inherent vulnerability of the site and neighborhood to flooding. The bottom 2 images are the site on the day after the hurricane. The trauma endured from the storm dominated much of our early public meetings, but eventually led to creative reimagining by community residents. And herein, I think, is another lesson. As designers, we may not have lived those same experiences, and we must be sensitive to the trauma and not expect folks to be immediately able to move on emotionally. So the key here is how we expanded the outreach process. Our client, the Parks Department, had assumed a perfunctory community engagement process using their standard process of relying on the community board as the conduit for input. Those would be the red boxes, and CB meaning community board 3, meeting 1, 2, 3, etc. The problem is that community boards are not always inclusive and frequently overlook voices who are left out for reasons that can include language barrier, distrust, lack of childcare, or merely disposable time. It was clear from the People's Plan that many stakeholders had indeed been missed by the EDC planning process, and we too noticed that some constituents were not in the room at the community board meetings. We requested a broader outreach to groups identified in the blue boxes, and our client agreed. Herein, I think, is another lesson. As planners and designers, we need to be able to craft a tailored stakeholder engagement process and advocate what we believe will be effective as part of the scope and contract, and also to be nimble as the process moves along. So how did we find these missing people? We reached out to the folks who were the key players in the People's Plan, and they invited us to a pop-up event in the future park. We set up a tent with information to begin to engage them in this new phase of planning for Pier 42's future. So Paths to Pier 42 is an outgrowth of the coalition of community-based organizations who spearheaded the People's Plan. There's some of them on the upper left there. These folks with local political support successfully lobbied the Parks Department for temporary activation of the site until permanent park construction could begin. So over the 5 years that Paths to Pier 42 operated as a seasonal destination, it helped build community trust and build a platform, a platform to build agency around long-term park programming that expresses the diversity of the residents and their cultures. Each year, local artists were invited to install a piece that would ignite the imagination of visitors, demonstrate that change was coming, and keep pressure on the agencies to fund and advance the permanent park. Another lesson learned from this project is that once we had identified these missing constituents, quote unquote, our team had to go to where folks lived, worked, or went to school, and we needed to speak their language, literally. Fortunately, our staff includes Mandarin and Spanish speakers who helped facilitate these conversations. I'll never forget our meeting with CAV, a Pan-Asian community-based organization that helps fight for racial and economic justice. That's the lower right image. I just stood in the back, not understanding a word that was being said, and simply reading the room through tones of voice, raised hands, and occasionally laughter. And luckily, no screaming. So once we had heard more voices and visions, we developed 4 program options based on a spectrum from most intensively active to most ecologically restorative. Program Group 1, and there's a reason for these boring names, is the most active. You may note that the precedent images, I know many of you may not be from New York City, but that the precedent images we used are all of parks within close proximity to the residents who would use Pier 42, as opposed to showing, precedent images from distant places. We did this specifically so people could relate either positively or negatively to what they had experienced in those nearby parks. Another lesson, so this is sort of how we developed all the program for people to understand. So another lesson from this project was how to make our ideas clear, regardless of the language, education, or age of our clients, as we call them. You will note that we didn't give these options sexy names, merely a number and a straightforward descriptor so as not to infuse any confusing bias. And we did this for all 4 options. Our intent was to provide meaningful programmatic alternatives that address the diversity of ideas we had heard, Kids in the neighborhood local schools were particularly interested in active recreation, but we also heard from older folks that they wanted gardens, orchards, and fishing spots. This option begins to take some risks and reaches beyond what the Parks Department had anticipated, removing parkland to create more porous and interactive waterfront edge, which coincidentally provides more waterfront perimeter with which to interact. You'll also notice that the topography, you can see that on the right images, is getting more pronounced, which was in direct response to the residents' requests for some form of flood mitigation measures. This last option is the most ecologically transformative. By removing portions of the bulkhead to allow the river into the site and removing sections of the collapsing pier, this would help blunt the forces of storm surge. In addition, this option creates areas for safe kayaking, fishing mini piers, oyster habitat on the remaining piles. This option, however, would require pushing boundaries with the regulatory agencies. At our, at our community sessions, which began with listening and evolved to offering these synthetic options, illustrating preferred program directions, we used a variety of tools to build social capital and allow the community to express their views as to how we could collectively transform the waterfront from an eyesore to a neighborhood asset that reflects and respects their cultural diversity. We went out on a fairly huge limb here and actually had people vote on their preferred option, in person, online, in their community centers and gymnasiums. People could vote for one upland idea and one waterfront idea from the 4 alternatives. In other words, this was not a top-down decision-making process. And we, of course, got buy-in from our client, the Parks Department, to pursue this democratic approach. The votes were tallied, and the preferred scheme for both upland and the pier was number 4, river ecology. I attribute this to 2 factors. The first was the gradual recovery from the trauma of the hurricane flooding to thinking creatively about ways to make their community more resilient in the future. The second was something I heard multiple times, which was that the neighborhood residents wanted a park that was multi-generational, a place they could be proud of, and a place that respected the aspirations of their community. This is the final plan that evolved as a hybrid where we did increase the perimeter waterfront exposure, but with less loss of parkland. Areas are set aside for flexible community-based programming, as well as permanent features, such as an ecologically themed playground and comfort station, so people who have traveled far to the park can linger for more than a few hours. Access and entry experience remained persistent concerns throughout the engagement process, and we took measures to create safe passage below the highway, separated the bike and pedestrian entrances, and created a visually welcoming point of arrival, which, needless to say, involves masking the DOT pothole structure. The project has been moving slowly, but thus far the shed has been removed, leaving only a few bays of the structure shown in the lower left image there in red for future flexible programming. And the rest of the park has gone out to bid just last month. With any luck, 12 years after this process began, the community will see their vision realized. Moving on to project 2. This project poses a very different scenario, where from day one, 2 of the most significant community activist organizations were at the table. The project area outlined in red is located in the South Bronx and comprises Hunts Point and Port Morris neighborhoods, isolated from much of the rest of the South Bronx by major highway and railway infrastructure and cut off from their waterfront by industrial uses. Prior to our firm being engaged to develop the community planning document, Sustainable South Bronx and the Point Community Development Corporation were active participants with EDC again in crafting the Hunts Point Vision Plan, which was a comprehensive look at multiple issues affecting the South Bronx. Both of these community organizations were leaders in environmental justice and had a deep understanding of their community's needs and concerns. One of the outgrowth recommendations from the Vision Plan was for EDC to embark on a Greenway master plan, which was awarded to our firm in 2004. These same players, now joined by MNLA, were the core planning team. Over the course of 2 years, with biweekly team meetings and many stakeholder events, we completed the Greenway plan. And from this plan, 6 priority projects were identified by neighborhood residents and businesses for immediate implementation. We conducted multiple meetings, all held at the Point, which defines its mission as dedicated to youth development and cultural and community revitalization of Hunts Point. Our meetings were accompanied by free food and childcare prepared and available on site. Our collective goal was to change the dialogue from one dominated by fear and distrust to one driven by social equity, vibrancy, and hope. A lesson here is that the Point is a trusted organization located in the heart of the residential part of Hunts Point. Folks go there regularly. They know it to be a place dedicated to their community. By lending their physical space to our project and using their outreach network, we were able to reach a broad audience. So why was creating a Greenway so high on the list of wants in the Hunts Point Vision Plan? These images typify the South Bronx waterfront when we began. Frankly, they are shocking, and they made us realize that we needed to understand the underlying forces that lead to and reinforce inequality. Digging deeper put into sharp focus policies and practices such as redlining and divisive transportation infrastructure, as well as systemic disinvestment and imposed uses that no neighborhood wants along its shoreline. These factors have resulted in serial disruption to these neighborhoods of color. Nowhere is the toxic intersection of racism and disinvestment in public space more palpable than the South Bronx. A lesson I learned from this project was my own ignorance of not piecing together the threads of history that underlie this seemingly objective land use map. As landscape architects, we owe it to these communities to educate ourselves before we even begin to embark on planning, much less design. The 12,000 people who live in Hunts Point, roughly the yellow area, are surrounded by industrial uses, the purple area. And that purple area, however, employs close to 16,000 people. These include, and so within that industrial area, these include a sewage treatment plant, the food distribution center that distributes wholesale meat, fish, and produce to 22 million people along the East Coast, numerous power plants, oil depots, a prison barge, and a waste transfer station. Now think about what all those uses mean to a neighborhood. Among many other things, air and water pollution, noise, ugly and unsafe streetscapes, not to mention all of the other issues of equity that we are talking about. And with many disinvested communities, there is a significant shortage of quality parkland and recreational facilities. This plan actually shows some of what the Greenway accomplished. Prior to 2006, there were just 3 open spaces in the neighborhood: a small ball field, a school playground, and a cemetery. So when we were awarded the project, the city's charge to us was to plan a Greenway around the perimeter of the peninsula. What we learned from our community partners, however, was that the plan had to be far more comprehensive and inclusive. So we expanded the brief to include these goals: I'll go over each one of them with illustrations. Some 14 years later, this is what has and has not been accomplished since our plan was completed. As you can see, first off, a perimeter greenway was not achievable due to the extensive amount of private industry and water-dependent infrastructure. So the plan became essentially a network that links people to jobs, mass transit, community assets, and recreational destinations, some of which actually lie beyond the boundaries of the peninsula. So principle number one, create a greenway that promotes a restorative and sustainable environment. This project, Hunts Point Landing, transforms a former roadway into an intertidal wetland and park that supports science programs in local schools, a place for workers in the food distribution center to have lunch, and offers a new waterfront destination. Now, before, here's what it looked like. A 100-foot wide dead-end road to the river with a food distributor to the north, a sanitation and facility and salt shed to the south, and the fish market to the west. How's that for some inviting neighbors? We successfully advocated to get the street demapped and converted to parkland. It took 3 years to get the various city agencies to agree, but another lesson learned is that in densely built up areas, one has to work hard to reallocate land uses to create open space opportunities. Even in its forlorn state, the site was always a popular fishing spot because of access to deep water. The fishermen became our clients. They owned the space, not the city. So we designed a pier for better access to deep water, added a kayak launch to support a local organization called Rocking the Boat that teaches local kids about boat building and water safety. The project has received special funding from a variety of sources because it is the first constructed intertidal wetland in the South Bronx. As I mentioned before, one of the unfortunate legacies of the industrial heritage is the expansive roadway network that used to allow large trucks, 77,000 per day to be exact, to rumble through the residential neighborhood, causing yet more noise, pollution, and danger to pedestrians. And asthma, I will also point out. We worked with local industries. So principle number two, create safe connections that promote a network linking places and people. So we work with local industries, residents, and the Department of Transportation to rationalize the truck routes and deploy various greening strategies to not only increase biomass, improve air quality, and capture stormwater, but also to physically preclude large trucks from turning onto residential streets. Bike lanes were added to create a network of alternative mobility to mass transit, jobs, and schools. This is one of the projects I am most proud of, and it's called Randall's Island Connector, that allows neighborhood residents to walk or bike to a largely recreational island with over 35 ball fields of various kinds, just a quarter of a mile away. As you may recall from the open space plan, there was only one sports field and is only one sports field in Hunts Point. This quarter-mile long multimodal path required constructing a bridge over a narrow waterway, see on the lower right, as well as crossing an active at-grade rail line. Suffice it to say, it took years to accomplish, but is a game changer for South Bronx residents to access large active recreational offerings. Obviously, this is what it looked like before. So why is this project so important? Before the connector, folks who wanted to get to the sports fields had to climb a flight of stairs and cross a highway bridge, upper left, to get to the sports fields. When we first saw this corridor with the high-speed Amtrak lines running a bit above the lower left image, as well as the duct banks, image on the right, crossing the narrow river, we saw another opportunity to transform this remarkable piece of infrastructure into public space. Okay, principle 3, create a greenway that nurtures physical interaction and well-being. Reducing health inequities became a guiding principle as we learned of the high percentage of negative health outcomes in the neighborhood. The Greenway project allows folks to reframe their relationship to the river and their community. Portions of the waterfront and many streets in the residential neighborhood are now viewed as assets that foster physical well-being, environmental health, and learning. Principle 4, create a greenway that generates economic benefit. While our Greenway plan and its outgrowth projects were not directly linked to economic benefit, all of us at the table sought ways to invest in economic opportunities, whether by providing safe access to employment centers, generating startup business opportunities, workforce training, and skill building. Many of these initiatives are sponsored by or advocated for by a growing network of local community organizations in the South Bronx that continues today. Principle number 5, create a greenway that encourages community-based participation in planning, design, and stewardship. The major lesson of this project is that our outreach process was collaboratively crafted with the community organizations at the table, which has helped build enduring agency and ownership. Their lived experiences in the South Bronx provided us with unique knowledge that we would not have otherwise understood through mere observation. And I'm pleased to report that our firm continues to work on multiple projects in the neighborhood, and the spirit of local activism lives on to fight systemic racism and transform the grim legacies of this past into a tangible economic, social, environmental, and health benefits. Now on to our third project. This is a very recent project that we embarked on as a pro bono effort to support the Neighborhoods Now initiative to address inequities brought into sharp focus by the pandemic. Initially, 5 underinvested neighborhoods were selected by the organizers, a joint effort by the Van Allen Institute and Urban Design Forum. I will speak somewhat interchangeably between Neighborhoods Now, the broader umbrella, and Kingsbridge, the specific neighborhood where we contributed our efforts. Volunteering firms were partnered with specific neighborhoods to bridge the gap between top-down resources and vulnerable populations. Our firm collaborated with a multidisciplinary team, shown on the upper left, with a local organization, the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, who set the priorities for the work, ranging from immediate relief efforts to support small businesses to broader visions to advocate for more public resources. Kingsbridge is a low-wealth community of color with 43% foreign-born population. What distinguishes this project from the other 2 I have shown is that each neighborhood organization directed the deployment of the team's technical resources to target locally specific needs. During our weekly meetings, they were also instrumental in formulating effective engagement. Language barriers, lack of access to Wi-Fi, not to mention the pandemic, and a high percentage of undocumented residents and absentee landlords were just some of the hurdles that had to be overcome. Similar to the South Bronx lesson, however, is that the local organizations already had the trust of the community and act as agents to connect small businesses and residents with the kinds of resources that we brought to the table. That's the royal we, by the way. The engagement process enabled our team to better target our efforts once we had a clearer grasp of neighborhood issues. Time and again, we heard isolation, violence, loss of employment as the predominant concerns. But we also heard how important outdoor spaces were during this pandemic period. It was interesting to hear of the breadth of open spaces that were named as favorite, including certain wide and shady sidewalks, community and church gardens, and unimproved open spaces in proximity to mass transit or significant buildings. Because of the urgency to address pandemic-generated challenges, Neighborhoods Now targeted smaller scale interventions, urban acupuncture, if you will, to accelerate more sustained advocacy and change. The goal, too, is to share decision-making with community members to co-create their public realm. One of the strategies that was effective during the pandemic was to engage community residents in outdoor activities that would help build agency and stewardship of their neighborhood. And specifically, our staff provided the tools and shared in several cleanup days. These kinds of shared activities help build community resilience and trust. Another shared activity was this mural. We collaborated with a local artist to paint this mural in a prominent location to help instill pride in Kingsbridge. Using art to bring the community together and engage residents in trust building through participation in a shared activity was a very effective and another key lesson we take away from this project. Our team's short-term initiatives capitalize on Kingsbridge cultural vibrancy to create a civic action plan as a roadmap for how to safely return, organize, and participate in civic life, as well as to jumpstart small business opportunities. In addition to these physical interventions, Neighborhoods Now organized financial workshops for small businesses, drafted legal templates for relief loans, and helped restaurants navigate the city approval process for outdoor dining. These long-term initiatives are intended as tools which the local organizations can continue to advocate for public investment. As the landscape architects on our team, we proposed a series of short and longer term initiatives in parks and underutilized spaces to diversify the types and scales of open spaces and to advocate for more public funding. We organized community volunteer days, tree planting demonstrations, and celebrating kind of whatever. The final report of Neighborhoods Now, which is available online, illustrates the results of each neighborhood team, as well as identifying 10 overarching policy recommendations moving forward. What began as a 6-week sprint to assist local businesses has turned into a long-term partnership with many of our firms continuing to facilitate implementation of projects as funding allows. A corollary lesson here is that the neighborhood coalitions working with small businesses and residents is helping to build stronger social networks and therefore social resilience. So I'm going to conclude with a few summary thoughts. And remarkably, yes, this is also in the Bronx. It's not about empowering people. They already have power. It's about harnessing that power by providing substantive ways for residents to co-create and engage in a meaningful process that is determining the future of their neighborhood. As landscape architects, we have to have the resolve to diversify our profession, look inward at our existing racist biases and practices, and create a bold culture of leadership, advocacy, and activism. Design can do many things, but we need to focus on advocating for and delivering equitable spaces that visually, psychologically, and physically represent our collective aspirations for the future. And finally, because of where we find ourselves today, remote and only digitally connected, we need to envision how, as we reopen our cities and towns, the public realm can offer a path forward to create social cohesion, heal communities, and advance equitable outcomes. So thank you, and happy to answer any questions. Did I do on time?
Thank you, Signe. That was great. No, that was perfect. We have about, I mean, your talk is till 45, so we have quite a while, but we already have some wonderful questions rolling in, and I would encourage everyone to keep on using the Q&A function. I just wanted to start with Catherine Sievett's question. And she wrote a lot about you and how wonderful your presentation was and how proud she is that you're a City College of New York landscape architecture alumna. And that she wants to liken your work to that of a long distance runner, or indeed an ultra marathoner. And you're clearly in this game for the long haul, I would agree. So what advice do you have for students and practitioners who might be seeking to be sprinters, especially as we so desperately need to affect social change and change these disinvestment narratives in the near term?
Well, thank you, Catherine. Sprinters. Well, I think that, as I kind of mentioned in the Kingsbridge project, and we certainly see this cropping up in the sort of I made it through the whole presentation. I see that this sort of tactical urbanism, these short-term interventions. I'm so sorry. Are perhaps what a sprinter could do. I feel that as I look around, agencies have gotten a bit more.
I'm sorry, I know you're recovering from a bad cough, so now is the time it decides to act up. That's how things work.
Sorry.
Take your time. It gives longer time for people to think.
So I guess we have to look at what are some short-term changes we can make. So if we look at cities that are, I think, really anxious and desperate to jumpstart their economies, I believe that there is some, let's call it regulatory leniency that we can capitalize on in terms of short-term initiatives. And in the words of the commissioner of the Department of Commissioner of Transportation from the last administration, she said her favorite 5-letter word was pilot. And that if you can't get an agency or a client of any kind to do something bold, maybe they'll do something as a pilot, as a test. If you design it in a way that it could be dismantled or relocated, then there's really no risk. There's no risk to the client. What's the worst that can happen? Right? That's what you just have to say to them. Well, what's the worst that can happen here? Well, got some graffiti on it. Somebody walks away with a bench. Try it. So that's what I would say to sprinters, is that take all of that sort of harnessed energy, take advantage of the moment, which I do think is at a critical juncture because of the the real desperation that cities are facing. And so whether that's transforming a parking lot into a temporary farmer's market, or it's converting a vacant lot into a something or other, propose it. And again, maybe just say, we want to try it for a year, like paths to Pier 42. Can we just have part of this site during the summer, just to do something, just to bring people here? And then, you know, one builds on another, and eventually you can affect change. I would say that, I guess that's my answer.
Awesome. So from an anonymous attendee, we have a great question, which is, how can emerging Black or Brown POC professionals find a space for themselves within the field of landscape architecture and play an active role in these projects that impact their own communities? How can we combat the illusion of inclusion, not simply on a project basis, but within our own teams?
Well, that's a lot to unpack there. Well, one, I don't know who this person is, obviously, but if you're I mean, one thing that would be really interesting, and I know there are a number of firms out there that are run by people of color. And I think that that's probably the most powerful position to find yourself in, because then you can direct the projects that you take on, and you can direct how those projects are co-created with communities. I would say if you are within a, shall we say, a largely white dominated firm, you might be part of this illusion of inclusion, and not perhaps be given the kind of leadership that you might like to have. But it takes a lot of stamina, if you will, to run a firm. And that's not for the faint of heart, that's for sure. And may not even be to people's liking, that they really want to invest that kind of energy in that particular activity. I'd say another really important role is to find yourself in a decision-making position within a community. So whether that is getting to an elected office, whether it is to be appointed as the local parks commissioner, be on planning boards, depending on the community. I don't know how every community is structured differently, but and maybe you can even do two things at the same time. In other words, community-based organizations are usually operating as on a volunteer basis. So you can volunteer for those at the same time that you're working on your own projects. But I think I really feel, if you think about Kofi Boone and a number of other people that I have the pleasure of getting to know on the Landscape Architecture Foundation, it's really interesting to see how people are finding their way. I guess what I would suggest, since I am not a person of color, is that you find mentors and you ask them, what do they feel is the most effective thing to do? I would feel somewhat out of place, really, telling you what's the right thing to do. All I'm suggesting is that if your goal is to help impact your community, look at the various ways that impact is achieved, and whether you can find a place for yourself within that so that you can be impactful.
Wonderful. From Helen Leah, we have a question. And she says, often it feels like there's so many things to know in this profession: transportation, planning, ecology, policy, and of course, design. So what are your recommendations on how to be informed and educated, but not overwhelmed?
Oh, boy. Um,
Or maybe you are overwhelmed, who knows?
well, Helen, I don't know how old you are or how many years whether you're a student or whether you're a practicing professional, but I guess it was, I guess I started out maybe thinking that and this was in the 70s, right, when I went to City College. The profession of landscape architecture was still considered rather limited then. And so I didn't worry about transportation planning so much, or I did worry about ecology. Policy didn't even register on my radar screen, and design, of course, did. So it's really only over the years that as the field has expanded in its influence, which of course I'm thrilled about, so too is the volume of knowledge that you need to have in order to operate effectively. All I can say is just take it one step at a time. I sort of liken landscape architects to like a conductor of an orchestra. You really can't play any one instrument fabulously, but you know how to make music out of all of those people out there. And so and I don't mean to make this sound stupid, like if you know a little bit about a lot, you've got to sometimes really do deep dives for certain kinds of projects. There's no question about it. I mean, I just have to say that I read all the time. I just read all the time. I'm constantly trying to learn more. But don't be overwhelmed. That's just let it it will happen. It will flow in, and maybe the way to kind of I don't want to say compartmentalize exactly, but the way to approach the information overload is to look at a project and try to understand what are the like 3 most important things about this project, and learn about those. And then maybe it will, take you in another direction ultimately, but you can't be encyclopedic ever, but certainly not right away. So just take it easy. It'll come one day at a time.
So much easier said than done.
Exactly.
So the next question is from D. Lawson Canning, and she asks, can you speak to how you advocated for the river ecology program option when it went significantly beyond the initial intent of the New York City Parks Department to land ultimately on the hybrid program?
Well, the marvelous thing is that I didn't really have to advocate for the river ecology program because the community did it for me. And literally that's why we had those really blah names. So once there was a really overwhelming support for that program, we then went to the Parks Department, and I guess the reason it was called the hybrid plan is that we looked at a variety of different ways that we could increase a perimeter waterfront at the same time that we could try to do something about some level of resiliency, as well as sort of ecological education, which a lot of the mothers that I spoke to in the neighborhood, they really wanted their children to have exposure to that. And there are a number of pretty good schools in the Lower East Side that are very eager to use the park as part of their education programs. So I guess I ended up using pretty technical engineering documentation for it, and just saying, we had pile studies that showed where the piles were in the worst condition, and they were either on the perimeter of the pier or up against the bulkhead. And so if you just looked at that pile plan that marine engineers had performed, we said, well, it's logical to get rid of that line of piles because they have to be replaced anyway, and they can't take any load. So that was one. And then, you know, we have had, thanks to many other landscape architects who have worked in the city of New York, including, of course, Michael Van Valkenburg, who you know, broke amazing ground with Brooklyn Bridge Park. And it really showed that on the East River, you could allow the river in. And that, yes, you need some kind of barriers and breakwaters and what have yous, but it is possible to do. So really looking at that lesson, and many of the residents of the Lower East Side had been to Brooklyn Bridge Park and liked it very much. It was not that hard to persuade the city that this was achievable. The riskier one was, I mean, we still have to get Department of Environmental Conservation approval for this. It's not a slam dunk. They're very strict, but we do feel that there's now enough precedent, and we do feel that the folks who run the downstate division of Department of Environmental Conservation in the state have become much more open-minded in terms of their willingness to look at alternatives to edge treatments. And then the other thing that's really kind of fabulous that we didn't know at the beginning of Pier 42 is that the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, which our firm is also working on, ties into Pier 42. So now we actually are creating a flood mitigation compartment for that neighborhood. I never pretended that Pier 42 was going to solve anybody's flooding issues, but today it actually will. And it's been a nightmare to coordinate, but it also is a really long-term benefit that we had not thought was going to happen.
Great.
Persuasion and facts, I guess I have to say. Perseverance and facts.
That seems to be a theme in a lot of your answers. So Benjamin Jensen asks, how can things such as smell from the adjacent industrial and sewage sites be addressed in landscapes located inside the industrial areas themselves?
Oh man, that was such a problem in the South Bronx. Because what I didn't really mention to you is that between the residential neighborhood and the industrial area is a whole belt of what's called light industry, which in the South Bronx is essentially chop shops or waste handlers. And so the amount of putrefying waste in that neighborhood is absolutely unreal. And then some years ago when we were working on the plan, so there's the sewage treatment plant, and then they took the sludge from the treatment plant and they turned it into pelletized fertilizer. And while that was all lovely and recycling on site and blah, 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 the odor was unreal. So I guess what I would say is there's nothing really you can do except study your prevailing winds. You know, I mean, I talked about like planting jasmine vines and stuff. Nothing's going to make that go away. Nothing's going to make it go away unless, I mean, what we ultimately, well, actually, what Sustainable South Bronx and the Point advocated for was closure of the pelletizing plant, and they succeeded. And with that gone, that was a huge benefit. And then we got the Department of City Planning to require these light industrial uses to screen themselves so that at least some of the odor was contained within their own properties. But I don't know of a miracle way uh, other than to address it locally. Once it's drifted onto your site, plant a lot of lavender. No, it doesn't work.
Right. So Tim Baird, our chair, asks,
Hi,
thank
Tim.
you for the, I guess he says, thanks for a great presentation, and asks, how do you navigate the sensitive issue of going beyond or around the community boards and community groups who, we're told, speak for the community residents?
This is a really big challenge. Now, so I don't know how local to New York the business of community boards is, but it started back in the late 60s, early 70s, where communities, much like today, were feeling left out of the planning process. And so there was no real structure to community input. And instead, groups would form like the Municipal Art Society and this one and that one. But there was no real theoretically grassroots kind of system. And so that started the community board system in New York City. And it's a volunteer position, but it's very political to get appointed to the community board. You got to know this one and then that one, and then the head of the community board knows somebody in the city council who knows the mayor. And so at the end of the day, if you really look at it, there are very few community boards that I would say are truly representative of their constituency. And by that I mean that there is virtually no neighborhood in New York that is of one ethnic group. One ethnic group may dominate, but there is hardly and because the community board districts are big, they're not like little zip code districts. So I do feel that okay, so how we did it was we went to the community board and we said, look, you've got a lot of schools in this neighborhood, and you've got high schools, and those high schools draw kids from outside of your district, outside of the community board. You've got teachers who live outside of the community board. These people, however, are going to be users of Pier 42. We have to talk to them. They're going to come use this park. How do we get them, who are not part of your community, but we want their input? And then there's the whole issue of the Chinese American community. And honestly, the way I went to a community board meeting. It was one of our first community board meetings. It was the first. And right after the meeting, a reporter came up to me and said, I'd like to ask you some questions. And I said, fine. And he said, I'm a reporter for the China Daily. I thought to myself, interesting. I didn't see any Asian faces in the room tonight. And so I said to him that very question. I said, how do we reach out to the Asian community here? And what would you suggest, and who should I speak to, and blah, blah, blah. So again, I went to the community board and I said, these folks aren't in the room. And then we also noticed that there were like no residents of the public housing. I said, would it be okay if we just go to their buildings and talk to them? Because, they don't have childcare, they don't have time. It's dinner time when these meetings are being held. They got 3 kids to feed and homework to assist with, and whatever. So if you calm down, not like I am right now, pretty agitated, and just speak about the fact that there are reasons why people aren't in the room, and do you see any harm? I mean, I didn't ask them, did they see any harm? I said, I'm going to go do it. But you just sort of kind of try to raise their awareness about why these folks aren't in the room. So, I mean, ultimately, we didn't take power away from the community board, right? The community board did have the final say in approving the program 4. So I think ultimately that's why it was okay. I think if it had come down to a situation where the non-community board members were at odds with the community board members, I'm not quite sure how that would have transpired. Honestly, I don't. I think probably up here, the Parks Department would have weighed in and done something. Now, I'm not sure it would have been a good thing, but they would have probably been left having to make a decision. There was also a lot of political support behind this project. Local elected representatives. And I think that if we had found ourselves, and they were big advocates for paths to Pier 42 and put forth all the money to get rid of the shed right away, even though it was well in advance of the rest of the park. I think we probably would have gone to those elected officials, try to go over the community board.
Thank you. And I want to honor Joseph Brooks's question, but I think there may be some overlap with what you were just talking about. So I'll ask it and then you can decide. In the voting process during your East River Park Pier 42 project, how did you address equality of access and information for residents so they knew they could vote?
Yes. That was, we went, what we found was very useful was not to have a meeting. Let's say we went to all the public housing projects, and rather than putting up posters and say, come join us tonight in the gym or the community center for a talk about Pier 42. Instead, what we would do is ask the tenants organization if we could speak at their regular monthly meeting. And so, while they're talking about, renovating the laundry room and, new sanitation regulations or whatever. And here we have somebody who'd like to talk to you about Pier 42. So we were we were a trusted speaker because we were speaking within their scheduled tenant process, and then we would leave cards for them to vote. We also had it online. The community board had it on their website. CAV, all the schools. So we just relied on the network that had been developed, and again the Paths to Pier 42 groups plural, to help us reach out to people. I mean, I don't know that we ever actually tallied. Well, I guess we did tally, but I never actually looked at it as what percentage of the population actually voted. You couldn't consider it like an elected, like voting for a congressperson or something. I mean, it was a robust, but I can't say that for sure it was. I feel like it was a good spectrum of the community, and that's what made me feel convinced that it was the right thing to do.
Great. So we have Mauricio Gomez thanking you for the presentation and asking you to elaborate on how the PDC reviews equity in New York City projects.
So, Mauricio, I suspect that this is, you know who I am then, right? That I am the president of the Public Design Commission, which I believe is what you mean by PDC. I was also referring during the presentation to an agency called EDC, the Economic Development Corporation. But if you're referring to the Public Design Commission, which I believe you are, because you use the word reviews equity in New York City projects. So the Public Design Commission, for those of you who don't know, is an agency that is under the mayor's office and was first started in 1898. And it is a group of 11 members that represent 4 professional disciplines: architecture, landscape architecture, sculpture, and painting, and then representatives of various significant organizations in the city, like cultural institutions, and then lay people. Our charge is to review design on any project that is built with public funding or built on public land. City-owned land, to be specific, city-owned land. So we can therefore review private developer projects if they're built on city-owned land. We obviously review any project that is funded by New York City for itself, like libraries and police stations and EMS stations and sewage treatment plants, all sorts of wacky stuff. We are not technically charged with reviewing equity, but I'll give you a very specific example. Under the Bloom, I've served on the design commission now for 2 different mayors. So under the Bloomberg administration, there was a really beautiful EMS station designed for a site in Staten Island. It was really elegant, on budget, you know, no frills. And then about maybe during the first term of de Blasio, came an EMS station in East New York. And it was horrible. It looked like a bunker. And so we challenged the architects and we said, why does this building look like a bunker? And their response to us was that they have a lot of drugs inside and that East New York has a high crime rate and they designed it like a bunker. And I said, not acceptable, not acceptable. Why does East New York deserve a worse EMS station than Staten Island? And so basically I used design to address equity. But I couldn't use equity as the argument, or, you know, we get lawsuits filed against us all the time, by the way. So you have to be careful how you use your words. And we did, we changed the design of the building. And we actually, because we work for the mayor, I mean, we're not paid, we're all volunteers. The staff elevated this to the mayor's office and said that, you know, we were very concerned that that the message was not getting through, and that everybody deserves good design. And tried to really tried to persuade the mayor that equity means good design for everybody. And so I would say that is what I spend my life doing on the design commission, is that, except I don't say it the way I've just said it to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was just a wonderfully robust Q&A, and we got so much out of your time. So yeah, I would like to thank you, Signe, again for this incredible talk. And if there are no other questions, we're going to end here and accommodate the next Zoom sessions. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of your time in this conference.
And thank you all.
Bye.
And Rachel especially.
Of course. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.